There are times that I just don't want to go to the grocery store. I mean, it's so much work. I have to get in my car, find a parking spot. I have to worry about getting those reusable bags out of the car. I always help them pack the grocery bag, so I have to worry about lining up the groceries correctly. And then I have to schlep it down to the car, and then I have to schlep it out of the car, and then I have to unpack the groceries. Wednesday's my day off. It's grocery shopping day, and my wife's not around. And unpacking them, oy, poor me, right? Poor me. I can tell you're feeling sorry for me. Because, of course, my labor pales in comparison to the folks who have to pick the strawberries, pick the lettuce, pick the blueberries, make sure the fresh fruit gets to the store so that I can bruise it up in my car on the way home, put into those hygienic clamshells that are so beautifully displayed in the grocery store. Dozens and dozens of hardworking hands that make it possible for me to get that fruit into my house. How often do you stop and think about them? How often when you pick the blueberries off the shelf at the grocery store, do you think about the person who reached down to pull those blueberries off the bush? Fruit pickers and packers and garment workers and factory laborers all abound, and truckers and maintenance workers, all the people who do the hard work to make our lives possible. This Monday, it's Labor Day, and it is so much more than just the last long weekend of summer. It's really a time for us to stop and recognize, be grateful for, and most importantly, ensure the well-being of all those whose labor makes our lives possible. And doing it here and now, not just because Monday is Labor Day, although that's a good reason, but also because of all the holidays, I think, of all the secular holidays in the year, I actually think Labor Day is the most Jewish. So let me tell you why, because I think in it reflects some of the core of Jewish values. So like most Jewish values, its origins derive from the Torah. It's our foundational story, as I hinted at earlier. The Micha Mocha captures that story of the Exodus from Egypt, but what was it all about? It was about a liberation from unjust servitude. That's the Exodus from Egypt. God's salvation ended our forced labor. Now, we could have told our national origin story any number of ways. It could have been about riches. It could have been about kings. It could have been just about the land. We could have left out that part. Instead, our national origin story begins with, we were slaves. We were forced laborers. And God's redemption, the Shamru, ends in a day of rest that's given to all. So it's no surprise then that the Torah is filled with laws about how to treat the laborer. Now, it's a product of its time, so it did allow slavery, but it's highly regulated. So women taken in war had to be treated with dignity. This in a world where that didn't happen. The Israelite indentured servants who fell into slavery because of their debt had to be offered freedom after 7 years. And a principle I think that remains even meaningful today, the laborer had to be paid their wages when they completed their work. They couldn't even wait until morning to be paid. And of course, the core of Shabbat is that all laborers get a day of rest. Our ancestors saw labor as a virtue. Kohelet or Ecclesiastes wrote in about 450 BCE or so that a worker's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat. And the sage Ben Sirach, writing in about 200 BCE, declared, "Hate not laborious work or animal husbandry, for it was ordained by God." The Talmud, about 500 CE, went on to declare that the one who enjoys the work of their hands is greater than the one who fears heaven. And this from rabbis, who are not necessarily known as being laborers. Let's be clear about that. Now, of course, to be honest and full disclosure, there are also examples of rabbis lamenting the fact that labor pulled people away from Torah study. We still say that. Your jobs take you away from Torah study once you're around more often. That Jews were laborers during the Middle Ages is actually captured in our names. My wife's name, Sobelman, Taylor, Fingerhut, also seems to be derived from Taylor. Ackerman, Feldman, farmers. Appleman, fruit workers, fruit growers. Drucker, a printer. Fabricant, manufacturer. Glasser. Schneiderman, absolutely. Glasser, I don't need to tell you what Glasser is. You know what that is. Goldschmidt, Goldberg, Goldstein. Perhaps all goldsmiths. Not all of us were moneylenders. But you get the point. Many of our names. You added one to my list as well. And there are rabbinic dictums from the 17th century up until our time that support workers' rights to organize. And they derive, many of them, from this particular passage in the Talmud, where our ancestors wrote, "The residents of a community are entitled to establish the community's units of measure, the price of commodities, and the wages paid to workers. They're also entitled to punish those who violate those rules." That was written 1,500 years ago. We can't leave out the return to the land of Israel, because one of the core Zionist dreams was of Jews laboring with their hands in the Holy Land, not only to rebuild that land, but also because of the purity, the physicality of labor. Israel's first political party and most powerful through 1977 was Labor Party, right, Mapai. It reflected the labor socialism of Israel's founders and their glorification of labor, of common laborer. And how many of us travelers to Israel came back with that goofy hat called a kova tembel, right? What was that about? Well, that was a symbol of the agricultural laborer. It was a symbol of virtue. In the 19th and the 20th centuries, as more and more Jewish workers immigrated to the U.S., we found common cause with the American labor movement. It was Jews who organized the United Garments Workers of America, the International Ladies Garment Workers. And of course, we all learned about him in junior high or high school, Samuel Gompers, a Jew who was involved in the establishment of the American Federation of Labor and was its president for 30 years. In 1900, Jews founded Der Arbeiterring, the Workers' Circle. Yiddish was the lingua franca of that organization, but it was all about the workers speaking Yiddish to each other, even as they practiced their somewhat secularized, socialized Judaism. So this is not going to surprise you. In 1973, down the street, Leo Beck Temple had a rally for the United Farm Workers where they brought in Cesar Chavez to speak. But what some of you old-timers might know if you've been here for a long time is Cesar Chavez also spoke from this bima. Now, it was not without controversy. Rabbi Hershey, you were there, right? You remember those days. And Rabbi Zeldin was never one to shy away from that controversy, and you can bet that he was well aware of the historical significance of the Jewish connection to labor. Now, over the last several decades, we've witnessed a diminution in the role of organized labor and the strength of organized labor. And both political parties, ironically, though expressing solidarity with America's laborers, haven't exactly passed legislation that was in their favor. Because in truth, there's always been ambivalence to the plight of the laborer in Jewish communities. Whether it was the factory owners, like my grandparents and my father, who didn't necessarily want unions and strikes in their places of business, or the other side, those in pursuit of economic justice, who said labor unions are the only viable path toward achieving true economic justice for the laborers. So our relationship is, like most things in Jewish life, complicated. The tension continues even today. There's a United Farm Workers bill that heads to Governor Newsom's desk. It would allow farm workers to vote by mail in union elections. Many in the California Legislative Jewish Caucus actually support it. In fact, it was written by Scott Wiener and Henry Stern, no relation, but they're both co-authors. And of course, many others in the same caucus don't support it, and it's likely to be vetoed by the governor. So regardless of where you stand in your support or opposition to labor unions, the truth is that in 1894, this country established the first Monday in September as our collective time to appreciate the laborers in our country. And now, recognizing our storied history, our Jewish community's relationship with those who labor with the sweat of their brows and the work of their hands, here's what I hope. I hope you'll take a little more time to appreciate those whose hard work enriches our lives. Because Labor Day really is more than just the last long weekend of summer. In many ways, it is a Jewish holy day. Amen.